Civil aviation, which includes unmanned aerial systems, is governed by a set of rules. But to get a real understanding of the rules, we have to go back to the early 20th century. In 1919, after the end of the First World War, the world community saw how aviation had advanced during the hostilities and how the international community would need to regulate aviation. So over 50 countries convened in Paris to agree on how it would be done. This is called the 1919 Paris Convention on Aviation. As a result of the Paris Convention, the British government passed the Air Navigation and Transport Act. The Air Navigation and Transport Act applied to all Commonwealth countries controlled by the British Empire, and Australia created its own act to comply. The Australian government passed the Air Navigation Act of 1920, and this act is still in force today. Of course, it has been amended a number of times. One of the most significant amendments came towards the end of the Second World War. Again, aviation advanced so rapidly during the war and international flights were so commonplace that new rules were needed to govern international aviation. Another convention to regulate civil aviation was held in 1944, this time in Chicago. This was called the 1944 Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation. And one of the key outcomes of this convention was the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. The Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation created more relevant and up-to-date rules for aviation, and also attempted to harmonise them around the world. Australia is a signatory to the Chicago Convention, and so our rules have been influenced by them. But the Air Navigation Act of 1920 with its amendments is still in force today. Under the Chicago Convention and the amendments to the Air Navigation Act, the Commonwealth of Australia may make laws to govern civil aviation within its territories. The Civil Aviation Act is a set of laws under which we operate. From this Act, two key bodies were formed to regulate aviation: the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, or CASA, and Air Services Australia. The regulations that have been made to enforce the Act are called the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations, or CASRs. So to recap, the Civil Aviation Act governs day-to-day aviation in Australia, and the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations are the set of rules that are applied. Now, Part 1, Section 2B of the Air Navigation Act, and Part 1, Section 4 of the Civil Aviation Act, as well as Part 200 of the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations, state that neither the Acts nor the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations apply to state aircraft. So what is a state aircraft? Well, all aircraft commanded by a member of the ADF on duty, whether it be an aircraft wearing defence markings or a hired civilian aircraft, are considered state aircraft. So technically, the Acts and the CASRs don't apply to our manned and unmanned systems. But we would be foolish not to take the civil regulations into consideration if we share the same airspace. Furthermore, many ADF personnel may wish to pursue unmanned aerial systems outside the military, so it's important to understand some of the regulations so we don't put ourselves, our aircraft, or the safety of civilians at risk. Even though the Act and the regulations don't apply to state aircraft, it does state in the Act that the Governor-General may make rules that apply to state aircraft. Furthermore, as part of the ICAO Convention, the Convention states that when issuing regulations for state aircraft, the state will have due regard for the safety of navigation of civil aircraft. Defence has its own aviation authority and its own set of rules that apply to ADF-commanded aircraft. Where the civilians have the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, CASA, Defence has the Defence Aviation Safety Authority, or DASA. And where the civilians have regulations called the Civilian Aviation Safety Regulations, Defence has the Defence Aviation Safety Regulations, or DASRs. Before we go any further, we need to discuss another organisation of which we must be aware: Air Services Australia. This organisation oversees and coordinates airspace. It is separate to CASA but works in conjunction with CASA. Air Services Australia looks after all the control towers, regulations regarding airports and airfields, navigation aids and airspace. The best way to think about them is to compare the two organisations with road traffic. The Department of Motor Transport makes rules regarding vehicles, things like roadworthiness, registration, licensing of drivers, testing and so on. The Department of Main Roads, on the other hand, looks after things like traffic lights, road signs, roadworks and speed limits. In civil aviation, CASA is like the Department of Motor Transport and looks after the airworthiness of aircraft, the training and the licensing of aircrew, aircraft registration and other rules. Whereas Air Services Australia is like the Department of Main Roads. It looks after the airways through which aircraft fly, navigation aids, airfields and their signage. Now that we understand what CASA and Air Services Australia do and what DASA does for defence, let's talk a bit on the rules. In civil aviation, the CASRs can be illustrated in this diagram, which shows key areas for regulation. This is called a bubble diagram. Airworthiness, licensing of aircrew and maintenance personnel, airways and operations are covered in the various sections of the regulations. The regulations controlling unmanned aircraft are part of the Air Operations section and as CASR Part 101, Unmanned Aircraft and Rockets. It's known merely by CASR 101 and contains regulations on such things as unmanned tethered and free balloons, rockets and unmanned aerial vehicles, or, as they call them, remotely piloted aircraft, RPA. In defence aviation, the regulations controlling unmanned aircraft also come under the Air Operations section of the DASRs and is known as the DASR UAS. There is also a section for remote pilots, but that has yet to be created, so for now, let's just concentrate on the rules that are in force. One last thing, the Chief of Air Force, as the ADF's aviation authority, is accountable to the CDF to ensure effective regulations are in place that are in line with contemporary international regulations. Then, when we look at the DASRs, they state the airworthiness authorities of the three services, that is, the senior officer responsible for aviation operations in his or her service, must ensure that the rules of the air are harmonised with national civil practice, wherever practicable, in order to ensure defence aviation can be interoperable with civilian aviation. In other words, because we share the same airspace, if we work on different rules, we have a higher risk of an accident. Each unit that operates aircraft, including unmanned aircraft, is responsible for ensuring flight safety, and this remains a command responsibility. This is where it's important to understand the history of UAS and where Army is, airworthiness and training standards, the rules of the air and operating in civilian airspace, our authority to operate UAS and defence rules as they apply to us, and risk management and command authorizations. These will be the subjects of the next videos.